Hello, everyone. My name is Chase Douglas. Thanks for hanging on tight while we get started. So today we are talking about restoring mountain ecosystems by Eco Impact sponsor, Canadian Mountain Network. We're really happy to have them last year and again this year as an impact sponsor. So to kick things off, I'm going to go over some housekeeping. All participants are muted during this presentation. For technical issues, please use the chat function. Any questions can be submitted through the chat/question box feature. A recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants within 24 hours. Just watch out for your emails, check your junk in case it goes there as well. So we're going to hit it off with the traditional land acknowledgement. Eco Canada and myself would like to recognize today and every day the land we live on. Eco Canada's commitment to regularization starts with acknowledging and honor the privilege to live and work within Territory 7. Eco Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and oral practices of these nations. So who is Eco Canada? Eco Canada is a steward of the environmental workforce across all industries. We champion the end-to-end career of an environmental professional. We not only train and certify professionals, but also help identify and address labor market gaps. Our efforts promote and drive responsible, sustainable economic growth to ensure that environmental care and best practices are a priority. So as I mentioned, Canadian Mountain Network is a sponsor for Impact last year, as well as this upcoming year, which will be held at the Weston and Calgary downtown. Our theme is retrofitting the workplace with empowering environmental innovation. I'm going to kick it off and hand it over to Canadian Mountain Network. Thanks.
Okay, now I can see your screen on the webinar. Now it's good. Yeah, now it's zoomed in. If you can zoom out so I can see Paulina and Marie.
All right. Go ahead. Hi, welcome. My name is Murray Humphries.
And I'm Paulina Johnson.
And we're joining you today from the Canadian Mountain Network. Both Paulina and myself are co-research directors at the Canadian Mountain Network, and we're excited. We just need to move in a little bit here. We're excited to be able to present a little bit about the work we're doing in mountain regions on behalf of Monique Dubé, our executive director, and Joe Dragon, the chair of the board. I'm a professor at McGill University in Haudenosaunee, Kanien'kehá:ka territory, but today I'm a visitor in Treaty 6 territories, where we've gathered as a group of from the Canadian Mountain Network to describe good paths forward. So I'll just pass it to Paulina to help situate us in space this morning.
Yes, welcome everybody. So today we are at the University of Alberta in the Treaty 6 territory. One of the biggest things that I like to kind of acknowledge is that we are very grateful, the Naskamun, for the opportunity to share the knowledges that we're going to give today, especially about restoring mountain ecosystems and what that means for Indigenous communities, but as an organization and ourselves. But this territory that we live on has been used for thousands of generations, has various stories, jokes, laughs, history, and just connection that continues today. So thank you all for joining us, and we are here today.
And we wanted to acknowledge this International Mountain Day and the focus of today's celebration of International Mountain Day on restoring mountain ecosystems. And we'll revisit that concept of from Canadian Mountain Network experience about restoration and the notions of ecosystem. But before we do, Paulina's just going to give us a little of a taste of restoration in an Indigenous context.
Absolutely. So when we start to think about restoring mountain ecosystems, it's not just restoring the knowledge and traditions, it's about healing. And that sense of healing allows not only Indigenous individuals, but settlers who share this territorial lands with us, the ability to know the vibrancy, but the richness of not only the land, but the place and the ancestors and spirits that live within that place, and give it meaning and what it means to us as an organization to help be part of that restoring and reclaiming and healing journey.
So we wanted to give you a brief kind of history of our organization, Canadian Mountain Network, because sadly this will be the last International Mountain Day that we'll have the opportunity to present to you as a network. Canadian Mountain Network was funded in April 2019 to March 2024. So just a few months from now, we'll come to an end as this network. And that's because we were funded from a network of Centers of Excellence program, a federal science program, which is also terminating in March 2024. So the original vision for the Canadian Mountain Network was reflected both the urgency and ambition of the challenge that they sought to address. Providing Canadians with state-of-the-art tools and knowledge based on multiple ways of knowing that are essential for informed decision-making to sustain and manage mountain places in the face of unprecedented environmental, economic, and societal changes. The original leaders of the network were Stan Booten as co-research director, and Norma Cassie, Vuntut Gwich'in knowledge holder from Old Crow, Yukon, as co-research director. Chief Joe Dragon was with us from the start, and several key staff, Matthew Barry and Christy Urban and Ainsley Ogden as a key advisor. And we really want to acknowledge the important role that these leaders did to create the opportunity that Paulina and I have now been able to carry on forward. Initially, for the Canadian Mountain Network, they identified 4 knowledge priority areas, exploring how Indigenous peoples apply Indigenous culture and knowledge to decision-making within mountain systems, advancing an integrated continental scale understanding of the impacts of climate change and human activities on mountain systems, identifying and developing innovative planning, risk, and governance models applicable to the unique nature of mountain systems, and finally exploring opportunities to support the viability and resilience of place-based livelihoods that sustain the resilience of mountain systems. When CMN was first envisioned, there was envisioned as 3 modes of research that the network would support. Mode 1, or conventional in the term that they used back then in the network, academic-led, university-based research on mountain systems. Mode 2 was partnered, and whether that was partnered with Indigenous communities or governments or municipalities or mountain industries. And the final mode 3 was community-led research that was kind of led by Indigenous research methods. I think that CMN had an important, from its inception, recognition of the importance of Indigenous-led research. It was the first network of centers of excellence to establish Indigenous governments and organizations as eligible partner organizations to hold funds, enter into a network agreement with a network. They initially committed to supporting Indigenous-led research with at least 1/3 of their research funding, which over the course of the network expanded to a larger and larger fraction of funding. They also spent some time kind of acknowledging and recognizing what Indigenous-led research means within the context of Canadian Mountain Network. To be led by an individual that self-identifies as Indigenous. All funding may be held by the Indigenous organizations or by other institutions, but that it must respond to identified Indigenous community needs and research priorities. It must receive detailed and formal support from Indigenous community leadership, and it must prioritize community engagement and capacity building, including Indigenous trainee development. So when we speak of Indigenous-led research within the Canadian Mountain Network, that's some of the concepts of Indigenous-led research that we prioritize. So these were the initial kind of a map and a sense of geography of place of the Mode 1 academic-led projects, the Mode 2 partnered research projects, and the Mode 3 Indigenous-led research projects that were funded initially through the network through 2019 to 20, and most of these projects have now been completed. Because the network ended up only funded for 5 years, we had a second and final call for proposals where we shifted away from the concept of research projects towards the concept of knowledge hubs. And we envisioned knowledge hubs as larger scaled initiatives that included research training and knowledge mobilization organized around networking and partnership. Kind of an opportunity for a hub to enable a diverse group of people and organizations to work together to build meaningful and sustained knowledge relationships in support of decision-making and action, focused on the resilience and health of mountain people and place, knowledge, kind of away from the word research to be inclusive of Western knowledges and Indigenous knowledges, and hubs as a center of activity that bring together a diverse group of participants oriented around shared priorities and objectives. We had an expression of interest, letters of interest, and finally full applications where we went from hundreds of expressions of interest down to eventually 7 knowledge hubs that were funded across Canadian mountain geographies. And I just show here, I won't go through all the assessment criteria, but I think it's important to think about how you evaluate and prioritize research approaches that get us a little away from the kind of conventional research output metrics. To prioritize Indigenous leadership, collaborative knowledge coming together, potential for realizing ethical space and guiding principles for ethical knowledge sharing and collaborations in knowledge hub development. We developed an ethical space model around how these knowledges could come together in a good and respectful and ethical way. And we were asking applicants to speak to how their hub would respect that ethical space. So these were the 7 hubs that were funded. Neo-Napene in Northwest Territories focused on Satu and Mountain Caribou, porcupine ecological change in the Gwich'in and the Nunavut regions of the North Slope, Yukon salmon culture focused on Yukon River salmon and the collapse of that, a really important contributor to culture and food security in the Yukon. The Pacific Indigenous and Protected Conserved Area Innovation Center, the Clinzy Mountain Caribou Recovery Project, the Nitsepsi East Slopes Blackfoot called Biocultural Hub, and the Chickasha watersheds focused in the Chickasha Mountains in Mi'kma'ki region of Quebec and New Brunswick. In addition to support of the knowledge hubs, we're very proud to have been a supporter and contributor to the Canadian Mountain Assessment, which was recently released this fall. This National Canadian Mountain Assessment provides a first of its kind look at what we know, do not know, and need to know about mountain systems in Canada. And the organization of the book is into 6 chapters focused on an introduction, mountain environments, mountains as homelands, gifts of the mountains, mountains under pressure, and desirable mountain futures. This has now been released and is available, and I think it's a really important resource for mountain knowledges in Canada. If you're interested in more kind of details of the history of the network and our approaches to braiding knowledges and knowledge hubs, there was a special focus issue called Mountain Research and Development in the journal Mountain Research and Development called Weaving Together Knowledges, Collaboration and Support of the Well-Being of Mountain Peoples and Regions. And we have a paper in that lead authored by Norma Cassie, former co-research director, and several of us at the organization around kind of the history of the network. And with that, we just wanted to show you a brief video that kind of speaks to the legacy of the Canadian Mountain Network. And then we'll end our presentation with some good news that all the work that we've initiated will be able to carry forward in the coming years. So here's the video.
We find ourselves in a time of reckoning in Canada. The decisions we make and actions we take will profoundly impact the collective health and well-being of generations to come. Changes to our environment, climate, lands, waters, and species at risk are occurring before our eyes. And so it began, the vision of the Canadian Mountain Network, or CMN, launched in 2019 with the generous support of the Government of Canada's Networks of Centres of Excellence, or NCE program, and hosted by the University of Alberta. CMN became Canada's first formal research organization that supports the resilience and health of Canada's mountain peoples and places through research partnerships based on Indigenous and Western ways of knowing that inform decision-making and action. CMN began with 3 modes of research: Western, Indigenous-led, and co-led, and over time transitioned into 2 modes of research, Indigenous-led and co-led. CMN also expanded its focus to mountains and beyond to enable greater dissemination of our learnings in the braiding of knowledge systems and environmental research. Our approach is crucial at a time when Canada's environments are undergoing rapid and uncertain change due to climate change, resource development, and biodiversity loss. Renewing nation-to-nation relationships with Indigenous peoples is a national priority. Through CMN's research, knowledge mobilization, training, and culture, the model of place-based, community-driven research that grades Western Indigenous knowledges has supported knowledge holders, scientists, and decision makers to work in a way that is decolonizing research in Canada. Over the course of 5 years, from coast to coast to coast, CMN has supported over 40 research initiatives, including innovative knowledge hubs, place-based research projects, and strategic initiatives. CMN has contributed over 175 publications, including many involving the braiding of knowledges. We have close to 300 products, innovations, and other knowledge mobilization activities in addition to our publications. CMN has supported 334 researchers and trained close to 200 trainees through significant national partnerships. CMN has also more than matched the original NCE investment of $18.3 million through cash and in-kind contributions. CMN also supports many strategic initiatives that enhance the connectivity of impact across our projects, hubs, and training initiatives by drawing out common lessons and knowledge that inform broader research, knowledge mobilization, and training outcomes. CMN's investments in partnerships and training have also been realized. For example, the vision captured in the Arctic Inspiration Prize was realized by successfully launching a land-based learning camp in the North that offered an opportunity for Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth to gain knowledge and capacity related to reconciliation, decolonization, and different ways of knowing. CMN has grown into its place in Canada's research ecosystem with an eye on the horizon. CMN would not exist if it were not for the vision of its visionaries, the efforts, lessons, and insights of its researchers, the enthusiasm of its youth and trainees, the support of its communities, the grounding and guidance of its volunteers, board of directors, research management committee, Indigenous circle of advisors, co-research directors, dedicated staff and contractors, the stability of its host institution, the University of Alberta, the support of our many funders, including the NCE and granting councils, as well as many partners and collaborators who have stood with us through our journey. We thank you. CMN has established itself as an essential element of Canada's research ecosystem, and that legacy is one to be proud of and yet to be humbled by, as our work has only just begun.
And just as we transition to our slides coming back up in the presentation, that was a summary of where we've been. And as we mentioned, that CMN as an entity will come to a close in just a few more months in the coming months as the NCE program comes to a completion. However, some good news on the horizon. The federal government in Canada launched a strategic science fund, which represented a new approach to federal investments. And we, as a network, applied to to the Strategic Science Fund. And just very hot off the press, we can say, as there was an announcement on December 6th of just last week of this year, that Canadian Mountain Network has been successful in being one of the 24 applications that is going to be funded over the next 5 years. We will transition to an organization called Braiding Knowledges Canada, moving beyond mountains in support of reconciliation through research. Many organizations, partner organizations, were very, very critical to the success of our application, and we look forward to carrying those partnerships forward through this new phase of our development. We see Braiding Knowledges Canada as the braiding of Western and Indigenous knowledges with federal science priorities through the Strategic Science Fund, through research, training, and knowledge mobilization that supports restoration, conservation, adaptation, and well-being. And we note that restoration word that's both a major theme of Braiding Knowledges Canada going forward and the International Mountain Day today. Our goal is to significantly enhance the influence of self-determined and place-based and co-produced knowledge within Canada's science culture, such that over time and on a path towards reconciliation, Indigenous and local knowledge approaches will contribute more to public policy and decision-making and become more fully and equitably reciprocal with federal science priorities. We plan to carry forward the Knowledge Hub approach to maintain our existing relationships and to grow those relationships geographically and through distinctions-based funding. We seek to support training pathways that develop talent and build capacity along a youth to leader learning continuum and a community to academic impact continuum. We seek to support impact connectors that support best practices, shared learning, and take all these local learnings and local knowledges to federal and national and international impact. And so with that, we will just kind of conclude with some reflections on where we've been and where we're going. We're very, very excited as a network to have this opportunity to support the knowledge and the good work that's happening in all these place-based and self-determined projects and try to continue to find good ways and new ways forward to support mountain systems. We will move in geography beyond those mountain systems to become a truly national Braiding Knowledges Canada network, but we will purposely carry forward those knowledge hubs and projects within mountain systems forward into our new legacy as Braiding Knowledges Canada. And so we very much want to honor those relationships and those places that have got us this far. And I'll just pass it back to Paulina for some more reflection on restoring mountain ecosystems in this context of Indigenous-led and self-determined research.
Thanks, Mary. One of the biggest teachings that my parents and my grandparents would often give me about mountains was that they were not just these large kind of beings. They were an entity of healing, of hope, of bringing not only our knowledge forward, but a place where we could find solitude in our own thoughts and coming to be as an individual. And so when I start to think about restoring mountain ecosystems and just the knowledge that is within Indigenous communities, is how do we bring that knowledge into the forefront within not only a Western perspective, but just a Canadian public perspective. And so allowing us to understand what mountains represent, not only in the stories, the traditions, the activities that happen there, right? You get a sense of the people, but also the humanity. And I think for us, when we start to think about the knowledge hubs and our way forward, it's that humanity of knowledges coming together to show us not only the brilliance, but just the depth. And so when we have that depth coming forward, we're starting to see just how actually complicated Indigenous knowledges truly are. And I think that's something that's really vital, especially when you start to understand restoring, is that seeing that knowledge from not only the ground level, but just as it builds itself out, right? It's a lot more intense than we could ever really kind of imagine. So having that opportunity to also kind of show that within the research or the work that we've been doing is really fundamental. And so when I start to think about restoring mountain ecosystems, it's not just, you know, that area of place, it's the individuals that come to it. And so how do you protect that? How do you advocate for that? And so for me, when we start to think about the animacy of mountains and that they're living beings, these great grandfathers, right? These are the grandfather of our communities and the protectors of that. I think for us, when we start to understand our role, especially as an organization, is how do we help build that knowledge up, but also protect that knowledge from not only being used as a way to say, well, we have Indigenous knowledges, but what are we doing with that Indigenous knowledge forward? And so I think for me, when we start to think about what restoring is, it's listening, especially to things that like don't talk, right? Because I always have these conversations with my students. So I think I forgot to mention that I'm also assistant professor here at the University of Alberta. And I get to teach not only Indigenous knowledges, but Indigenous research methods, and trying to let my students kind of expand their minds to think, well, okay, let's say hypothetically, you think you're the only beings in this room. There could actually be other entities, beings, right? And they kind of have a hard time with that because they're like, there's no one else here, right? So they kind of are like, oh, I don't know if Dr. Johnson's on the right path, right? And so they start to like kind of question, but I was like, you gotta like let your mind kind of open, right? Because when you kind of have a closed off kind of point of view, this is where I think we get really stuck. So it's allowing us that ability to kind of open our minds, but also understand, well, when you allow yourself to kind of challenge the foundation that our society kind of built our kind of knowledge systems on, it's kind of like, it's kind of unnerving because you don't know, there's the fear of the unknown, right? And I think when we start to think about the fear of the unknown, well, that's when we get the problems. But it's actually seeing the world in a very different lens, a different worldview. And so restoring mountain ecosystems is bringing out that different worldview and what that means for Indigenous peoples, but also just the collective of the whole. And so I guess my point is, when we start to think about that, is that we have a lot more work ahead of us, but also it's bringing those different worldviews, philosophies, epistemologies, ontology, creation stories that are actually representative of the people and the legal codes of who we are. And that, for me, is what restoring mountain ecosystems is not just a place, but the entirety of the collective, of the humanity, of the richness of their culture and traditions, but specifically that knowledge. And knowledge, especially in, so I'm Nehio, a Nehewak, Four Spirit, or as the government calls us, Plains Cree, right? Knowledge isn't confined with like a box or a linear time structure. It's secular, it's always happening and continuing. And so I think when we start to understand that different worldview, once we really fully embrace how to think differently or expand our minds, right, you can do a lot more than what I think is even possible. And so I'm really excited to see how we're going to do that, especially as Braiding Knowledges Canada. And I think I'm really honored to do that with you, Murray, because one of the things I think I want to mention is, so in my community, we have traditional adoptions or taking someone as kinship. And so actually I've taken Murray as my brother, which is really important because, or like as a brother-sister duo, we're gonna have fights, right? But it's because we want to work through these tough issues of how do we bridge Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledges, and how do we support each other, right? And different paths to get to where we need to go. And that's what restoring also means, is also having the faith to restore the traditional, agreements of these territories. So Treaty 6, for instance, where we're situated on, was about building kinship, building continued livelihoods together. And somewhere along the historical line, right, that knowledge is dropped. So Murray and I being able to do that, especially within our capacity as co-research directors, it allows us to do that in a good and meaningful way. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And we just to conclude, we wanted to acknowledge the mountain scientists and researchers, the mountain knowledge holders, the mountain people, the mountain places that have supported our work over the last 5 years. Want to thank the Network of Centers of Excellence for the funding that allowed the work to be possible. University of Alberta, our host institution, we're gathered here today on the University of Alberta campus. And you guys can't see our perspective as we're standing in the room, but we have to tell you that we have the honor of giving this presentation to many key contributors to the Canadian Mountain Network that are here in the room with us, and that without them, this work would not have happened. And so thank you to the people in this room that aren't visible on the screen for all the work you've done in supporting Paulina and I, and we just look very forward to heading into that unknown ahead of work towards braiding knowledges in mountain systems. So happy International Mountain Day, everyone, and it's been a real honor to present to you today.
So I think as we're waiting for questions to come in, it's going to be my responsibility to ask a question. For those of you that can't see me, my name is Dr. Jim Morrow. I'm the Indigenous Engagement Coordinator at the Canadian Mountain Network. And can you give me a specific example of restoration through kind of braided knowledge or Indigenous-led knowledge, and just something in the work that you've done that's truly impressed you from the Indigenous side?
The mountain, I think like Bill Snow's right. Or is he talking?
Paulina and I are just wondering if you're speaking with our own experience or within the support of Canadian Mountain Network. If I could offer one from my own experience, when you ask the question, the words that reconcile, that I had the opportunity to be involved in a project in North Yukon in Norma Cassie, former co-research director, Norma Cassie's traditional territory of the Vuntut-Gwitchin. And this project focused on a place called Old Crow Flats, which the community refers to as their bank, a place that they could always rely on to go and get food when the caribou didn't come close to town. But it was a place that's kind of hard to get to from town. With low water levels on the river and inconsistent snow conditions, it was sometimes a place that many people from the community didn't have, especially young people, the same amount of opportunity to spend there as maybe their parents and their grandparents had. And seeing that research project, and in a strange way, the research project ended up, with helicopters and all this infrastructure, Western science infrastructure, but in doing so, it gave youth the opportunity to serve as research assistants and to get out to the flats, and in some cases visit their families' camps where they hadn't ever been before. And seeing those youth come back to town and talk to their parents and talk to their grandparents about where they were and what they did. And sure, it was with a fancy GPS or a fancy water sample, but there was a restoration of relationship. It was different than it was in the past, but it still brought something back, I think, to the youth and to the community through that process. So from a Western science lens, you can see how it in some ways led to that cultural restoration or relationship restoration.
You want to try to answer it, Paulina?
I think for me, when I start to think about within my own research, so we have just kind of started my own research project, but we're more focused on relationality. And I think when we start to think about like what Murray says, it's not just like the science, it's the faces of the individuals who partake. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'll just restart?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. Well, it was more or less about, I lost my train of thought.
It was about relationality.
Yeah, it was just like you're building those relationships that, like, even though you have like the science aspect of that, I think one of the things that I always tell people is Indigenous people are very much adaptable. And when something works, like they go with it. And and like, it's not for the ease of access, but it's something that is really vital, is just seeing how, even though the relationships of being on foot compared to helicopter has changed, that same experience is still there, right? like what their grandparents went through, their great grandparents, and now they get to live that. And so my research was more or less focused on the relationships. It's about how do you build those relationships, but also how do you become aware of them. And I think one of the projects that's always kind of like stood out to me, especially in one of the knowledge hubs, is the work that Bill Snow is doing with the bison restoration in Banff. And him being from the Stoney Nakoda, right? So I always say this, like I've told this to everybody, like my great grandfather is from Morley in Stoney Nakoda. So like I feel that connection there, but also just it's when you see too. I remember just watching the videos of like the bison being restored into the park, like that energy, that spirit. That's what we're like. Well, that's really what I'm after, is how do you bring that spirit back and how do you restore it? And so that's one kind of example that I like to kind of present from the Canadian Mountain Network that is really vital to understanding like what we're really doing is not just research, it's that emotion, it's that restoring that connection and just the livelihood of those beings and ancestors, and seeing the community engage in that. And I think that for me is so much, it's so powerful but significant to what we do and what we're going to do.
I think, okay, so we had no more questions still coming in. So you already used the word relationality.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I'm also an instructor, and one of the things I really push with my students when we talk about ecology is that the Greek root word for that actually means household. And you know, if we're restoring this kind of household that we're in, we're restoring the way that we've lived in these lands. One of those important things is relationships. And I think oftentimes, you know, ecology itself is a study of these relationships. How do we focus on rebuilding these relationships, not just, you know, in terms of mountain ecosystems, but between peoples, between languages? Do you have any tools, tricks, advice?
I think, okay, so I think for me, when I start to think about relationships, right, it's about the ability to have connection, but also like communication. I think if you can't have open communication, the trust, so that relationship's never going to really establish itself. And so I think for us, when we start to think about like building that household or just building that community or the collective, it's not only diplomacy, but also understanding, right? I think in the Western tradition, our egos a lot of the time get in the way, and we have to kind of almost always be right. And that's the problem, right? So one of the tricks, or one of the ways that I kind of think about it, is we're taught from a very young age to kind of listen, but also to kind of critique, but also sometimes to defend. So if we're going to be building good and meaningful relationships, we have to listen to the context of the experience. So from an Indigenous point of view, right, often we have to bring it out colonization, not as a way to be like, well, this is what happened to us as like a blame, but this is the context of why we're in the position that we are. And I always tell people, it's not that there's no shame involved, there's no like pointing fingers, but we have to know that context to get that emotional understanding, to get to what is actually on the line. And so it takes time. And I think for many people, when they start to build relationships, especially within Indigenous communities, they think that one visit is the go, but it's not that. It means it's actually multiple visits, years, commitments. Like I always tell people, you can't just go into community and expect that they will just give all the knowledge, you know, freely. And some people really think that it still works like that, but you have to build that connection. You have to build that trust. And I think what I'm trying to really get at is it takes time, but you also have to know that sometimes the communities or even the households you're working in, they're not prepared for some of the questions that you may have. Because they're worried about another reality that they're experiencing. So you have to navigate that as well. I think the best kind of advice I can give is to listen. But also if you have that true heart and intention, right, you're always going to have that commitment to go back and also establish those relationships. So relationality is about that. It's also saying like, you know, there's a social cultural event going on. That's like your opening to go. One of the things I always tell people is like elders is like, especially in my community, they'll be like, oh, there's a round dance on Tuesday or, you know, or like Saturday at 6. that's basically an invitation. Like people are like, oh, they just told me there's a round dance. It's like, no, that's them telling you to go to the round dance, you know? So like reading between the lines. But I think for just research sake, and just also when we start to think about restoring these households, it's building that connection. And like with Murray and I's like a relationship or friendship or what, I don't even know what to call it, really, you know, but like we're able to have that conversation. And like sometimes it's really hard conversations, right? But then sometimes it's really out of hand conversation, like out of pocket, like, you know, like, but you're allowed to do that. And like and that's something that I think is really vital, is how to do that. But also give each other like the humanity of respect. Respect is so vital, but also honesty. And knowing also too, like I don't have all the information. Murray may not have all the information, but we're working together, right? That's true collaboration, but that's true partnership. So I think, yeah, sorry.
And I just, for any natural scientists that are, as a natural scientist, I can speak to the natural scientists, and I'm afraid we've all been misinformed a bit. You've been kind of told that your discipline focuses on nature and environment and not people and not health, but that's wrong. You've been taught it has to be measured to matter. That's not true. You've been taught that if it's not published, it doesn't exist. That's not true. There's all sorts of things that live beyond the realm of measurable that are really, really important, and it's just an invitation to explore those spaces. Do we have a question?
Yeah, we have two questions that came in actually. The first one is, what's the role of industry in, sorry, skip down there. So what's the role of industry in achieving like sustainable economic outcomes in this kind of Braiding Knowledges Canada? So it's an industry-based question.
Yeah, I think one of the ways we've approached that through the Knowledge Hub model is to really allow that self-determination and place-based prioritization of the people that come to the table. And I think we were really not surprised, but impressed by the diversity of organizations, industry, government, First Nations, Métis and Inuit, not-for-profit NGOs that were seen as being part of the solution and part of the conversation in many hubs. And so to kind of let that come at a regional perspective and let that emerge from our supportive place-based work is one of the ways we've approached that.
And then we have another question, that mountain ecosystems have been under pressure, facing many challenges. In some ways, it has been difficult to slow down the socioeconomic environmental dynamics. How do you foresee the braiding of knowledge as helping to restore ecosystems more effectively or efficiently?
Well, I think from like an Indigenous lens is that Indigenous knowledge has been there for a very long time, since time immemorial, right? Understanding, right, Swinburne and the like. But I think the knowledge is there. We just have to learn how to bring it forward at not only a good rate, but it's really hard, especially because climate change is coming at a very fast kind of rate, but it doesn't work within the relationships of Indigenous communities. But it doesn't mean that it's not possible. So I think for me, especially when we start to understand there are solutions within Indigenous research, but we need to do that work hand in hand with Western scientists to also not only change policy, but also knowledge. I think one of the things that we really struggle with sometimes is legitimizing Indigenous knowledges. And sometimes we have to have the backing from Western scientists, right, to have even like a call for change. But I think it's also having like respect that those knowledges have been there for a very long time. So how do we allow them to come forward, but also how do we build into that not only those relationships, but having that knowledge out there? So I guess for me, what I'm trying to say really is that there are solutions there. We just have to find the connection points to get it. And so that also too takes time, but also can be difficult. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would just also add that the kind of holism of the approach, of the mindset, and the focus on not kind of knowledge for knowledge's sake, but knowledge for application and to help places and people. Gives you a framing as a biologist. Sometimes we are a little too far from town in where we do our work, and we're a little too far from policy and in where we apply our work. We're kind of far afield. I think including Indigenous peoples and their worldview that's inclusive and relational, and partnering with all those organizations that are the decision makers. I almost view the work as coming down the mountain, not just focused on the high glaciers and the high elevation tree line, but down into the mucky muck of decision making and impact and outcome and restoration. So I think coming down the mountain a little bit into the people and the policy is helpful.
It's actually really funny you ended on that point. The next question comes from Jason Wegman, who's a landscape architect. And his question is there anything that you've experienced or learned in the mountain environment that's actually applicable downstream in the urban environments? And especially they're curious about this idea of relationality coming down off the mountain. What's your Moses moment, I guess is the question.
Just the flow of water down the mountain, that connectivity. I'm a wildlife guy, and I think of diversity gradients, and there's a latitudinal diversity gradient, so that there's more species in the south than in the north. But mountains bend those lines north. They bring all that diversity to bear, and so I think just that connectivity and flow, and that when we say we're expanding from Canadian Mountain Network to BKC, that expansion's already happened because all the place-based work that we've supported has taken us through that flow and from the mountains to the coast to the oceans to the streams and to the wetlands. So it's just a natural connectivity of life, I think.
Want to take a shot at it? Want to continue to talk about relationality, Paulina?
I guess, like, in what capacity are we talking? Like in
Yeah,
the question?
Yeah, the question was specifically about like what experiences can you bring off the mountain, and what's the application of what we're doing in these distant ecosystems, far off places from here we are in Edmonton, Amiskwaskatchewan, right? And how is these learnings applicable in an urban environment?
I think especially when we start to think from like an urban kind of point of view, or just like off the mountains, especially with relationality, it's also building that trust, as I said, but also that ability to have those conversations. And sometimes one of the biggest things that I tell people is like those difficult conversations are sometimes the ones that you have to have so that you can get to building that connection, right? And I think when you have those difficult conversations, it also builds like for individuals, they kind of get uncomfortable. And I think us as individuals and just humans, when we're uncomfortable, like we really shy away. But that uncomfortableness is not like calling you out as an individual. It's actually challenging the foundations of what you know. So I always tell my students, especially like, for instance, like on topics of like race and racism, it's not calling out you as an individual, it's calling out the systems that are in place. And so it's breaking a foundation that you've been taught to think is only one way. And this is why many students, when they take my Indigenous research course, when I teach them actually relationality, they have a hard time because many of them, and this isn't to like expose them, but some of them actually will cry in class. And I was like, what you're feeling is that, I've told you to be aware of the ancestors in this room. I've told you to be aware that you're not alone. And for us, especially in the world, when if we don't see that, right, you have a hard time actually believing it. And so I teach them in this way that allows them to understand that it's not just them in that seat, right? There's others around them. There's animals, the natural environments. And so when they start to get that uncomfortableness out, it's actually they're allowing themselves to open up. And for many people, that's really, really difficult, is because it's that fear that they may not know how to control it. Because we always like to be in control, right, in our own lives, right? Like this morning, my car tire was flat. I was like, there's nothing I can do, right? And I'm just gonna go with the flow, right? But many people have a really hard time with that because it's very easy, right? And I think sometimes, from like an academic sense, I like that control, but like from an Indigenous point of view, like some things happen, right? It was slowing me down, or there was a teaching in that. And you have to open yourself up to being like, okay, especially from in my own point of view in lives is, you know, am I actually listening to listen, right? Or am I listening to respond or to defend? And so for me, especially from a relationality point of view, when we bring into that urban settings or even any kind of discussions, it's allowing ourselves also to be vulnerable. And I think that's something that is really, really key in my research is I think in our society, we're always told not to cry. Or don't cry, don't show emotion, especially for like men, right? But sometimes you need that. It is a part of who we are as individuals. And so I'm getting very much more philosophical right now. But I think in the larger scheme of things, right, those are off the mound, and those are not just within Indigenous research. That's in building good relationships. And that doesn't just have to be with Indigenous communities. That's with everyone, right? So.
Yeah, I think as we have to wind up, we're running a little low on time. I think one of the other questions, I'm going to fold two questions together. One is, what's the relationship with kind of industry still? Is how do we build up these relationships with industry? And what's the knowledge that we can provide industry? I mean, we do provide for the community, and the community does involve industry in one way or another. And another was just asking about case studies from the network itself. If there's any kind of applicable case studies that we can speak to for restoration.
Yeah, and I think the question's causing me to reflect a bit on that, kind of at a national scale or a pan network scale. What's the role of industry at that? And I think sometimes it's individual companies, but it's also kind of mining associations and forestry associations and some of those kind of the notion of best practices and respectful inclusion of different ways of knowing within their science and policy. But just a case study, and if I can wrap up two answers in one, to go back to place-based, I just focus on another project that we've supported in the Clinzies, caribou recovery. And so this is a mountain caribou herd that's declined to very low levels, 20 individuals, and the West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations recognized the need to do something, and the immediate something was very intensive maternity penning to recover, allow calf caribou to survive to an age where they're less vulnerable to predations. But at the same time, a recognition that the bigger drivers and the larger scale issues was the industrial development and large scale kind of linear features in that landscape. And so they're doing very much the short term fix to try to get that herd recovered to a point of sustainability, and they've been successful in getting the herd back to 100 and more caribou. But they're also doing the long hard work of restoration in partnership with government, federal, provincial, with industry, road reclamation, all the, what happens to the footprint after the industry the activity has reduced. How can those landscapes be recovered in a way that's more consistent with people and livelihood? So I think that's an example where industry is very much a part of that restoration effort to support the caribou herd.
Want to answer any of that, Paulina?
No.
I think one of the questions here that kind of made an appearance is a question of materiality and material itself. And that's one of the things that we kind of struggle with, right? Is how do I get this material into this location? And a lot of the work that we do in mountains are in distant locations. And, like a lot of our researchers do travel by helicopter, right? We transported buffalo by helicopter. And I've always been thinking about this, is Western science just limited to a method, or is Western science a tool? Is it a technology? It's a very general question, right? But it's one of those that we do have to answer in terms of material and what we do and organization. Like I said, while you're thinking about that, when I teach my students, I talk a lot about sustainability, but I always push the idea that we also work in the field of sustainment, right? So what we're doing isn't just now, it's secular. It's, we're going to work in the circular economy. We're going to push things into much longer time frames. And to do that, we have to have an operation in place, and I have to have the material in place to do that. but to restore these ecosystems does mean we have to fly buffalo in the far off locations. I just think about that. It's kind of amazing that we did that. So, have any suggestions, any kind of conversation about material?
I think it's fully acknowledged, and as a researcher that uses helicopters and all sorts of infrastructure, but I also recognizing that where we work is a homeland of people, and it's the backyard of people, and that there's an opportunity to the landscape architect question. Another kind of lesson is about the importance of a place like Mount Royal right in the middle of Montreal, and that's also a really important mountain feature that warrants social, ecological, geological study. So I think, and I've had the opportunity to travel by boat and by foot and by snowshoe and snow machine with local knowledge holders, and you don't get as far, but you maybe learn a bit more on the way. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of focus a little closer to people's homes in some of that work.
I think for me, I was just thinking about what you said, if it was like a method or a tool. I think it's all of that kind of combined, right? Is building all of not only Indigenous knowledges together, but with like the Western field, is we can build into something that understands, the complexity, but the depth of place, of space, of the knowledge, but also, as Mary was saying, the individuals and the homes. And so I think for me, what I was really kind of thinking about when you were asking that question is that it's all of that, right? It's all of what we're really trying to achieve overall as a collective. And I think that's something that's really significant, is that we do need all of it. And I think that's what will make us very, not only distinct, but also powerful in leading that change, going back into mountain ecosystems, but just ecosystems in general. How do you restore it? And how do you acknowledge that what could be? So I think my mind is that it all needs to be part of that. So. Yeah.
So I think we're actually out of time now, so I can give you a break. So to those who are tuning in, I'm going to send you back to Chase at Eco Canada, and he will say goodbye. But those of you who have attended, thank you on behalf of Canadian Mountain Network and Braiding Knowledges Canada. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Hey there, everybody. I just want to say thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated you joining us, as well as please follow our socials for more webinars we will be hosting, as well as many more events, including our Impact 2024, which is coming up in February. Everyone should be getting a recording of this within 24 hours. Please check your junk mail because sometimes it ends up there. Thank you very much for attending. Bye-bye.